To We All Have a Role to Play in Suicide Prevention, a speaker series that we are here tonight to empower our community with hope and readiness. So I hope you're ready for a fantastic evening. My name is Beth Dorman. I'm the president and CEO of For All Seasons. On behalf of our staff and the board of directors that join me this evening, we welcome you. Tonight's event is a part of No Matter What You Matter. This is a campaign that started over 5 years ago when a community member provided folks in the community an opportunity to go to New York City and see the musical Dear Evan Hansen. For those of you who are not familiar with Dear Evan Hansen, it's a musical that shares the story of a high school student who commits suicide. It takes you through the emotion, through the family, and through the community. And as we came back from that show, we reached out to both Richard Marks and Amy Haynes, who had sent us down to New York for the day, and said, we're going to do something here in our community that doesn't make this just a trip to Broadway. And with that, we created No Matter What You Matter, because our agency, while we are an outpatient mental health clinic, rape crisis center, and the trauma center for the Shore, we also have a responsibility to talk about prevention and education. And that's where No Matter What You Matter came from. So we introduced a couple of years ago, Ask, Listen, and Share. And every year we've brought back those 3 words to the community as a way to have a powerful message that's simple and easy to remember. Ask if someone's doing okay. Listen to their response, and then share the resources. Our goal tonight is to help everyone understand the role that we each play individually and as a community in preventing suicide, and to be confident in playing that role. Maybe you're a concerned parent, a teacher, an employer, a church leader. Maybe you're a coach, a teammate, a friend. We all have a role to play. And by the end of tonight, we're hoping that you will understand how you can impact the lives of those around you. We also realize in a night like tonight that this event and the topic that we're talking about can be triggering for folks as you sit in the audience, for those of you at home. And so we want you to know that we have some of our staff here, Dr. Bill Serrato, our Chief Medical Officer, Lisa Lee, our Chief Clinical Officer, are here in the audience tonight. And should you need any support, please just step out into the lobby and we will make sure to connect people with you today here at the theater. For those of you online, we will have our crisis hotlines on Facebook, so please feel free to reach out to our crisis support. Whether you're joining us tonight at the Avalon or at home through live stream, we want you to be a part of a conversation. So I'm going to introduce our speaker to you in a minute. We will then do a talk back after he's done presenting, and then we'll invite you as the audience to ask questions, and you at home, you can all be submitting questions through Facebook, and those will get up to us here on stage. Before I continue, I do want to recognize some of our elected officials that have joined us tonight. Mike Arnst, representing Congressman Andy Harris's office, Senator Johnny Moutz, Maryland Delegate Jeff Geist, David Foster, the mayor of Chestertown, Talbot County Councilman Pete Lesher, Talbot County Sheriff Joe Gamble, and I see right there the Chief of Police. He wasn't on my list, but I'm so glad you're here. And I also want to recognize Helene Sweet, who is part of our Governor's Office of Suicide Prevention, and we want to make sure to recognize her as well. She's a local community member that we've had some great conversations tonight about how we can be working together with an initiative that the governor is sponsoring. And so now here's my favorite part of the night. I get to introduce you to an incredible man who I had the opportunity to meet several months ago, Dr. Andrew Moon. He's a clinical psychologist whose career focus has been on trauma, suicide prevention, and community education. He's the Senior Advisor of Partnership Engagement and Education at the Department of Defense Suicide Prevention Office. Prior to that role, Dr. Moon served as the Associate Director of the Veterans Affairs Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. And earlier in his career, Dr. Moon worked with young adults who have experienced trauma, loss, and suicidality. What I can tell you is that Dr. Moon not only is incredibly skilled in the work that he does, but he is someone who has become a part of this community. His aunt, Laura Moon Tannehill, serves on our board. We're incredibly grateful that she has made this connection for us. And this is a moment in a community where we have someone who is coming to us from not just a small town, but a large area where he serves and helps to lead. Andy and I were just talking in the back, and he said, sometimes we get pulled into other things. He's spending his entire month focused on suicide prevention education for his office. So we are super excited to have him here with us tonight, so please give Dr. Moon a warm welcome. Thank you.
Good evening. So I'm Dr. Andrew Moon. Andrew's fine. The doctor part matters sometimes, doesn't have to matter tonight. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all. My career path has taken me many places, and this is one of the most important because you are here to learn, you are here to engage, you're here to figure out what your role is in this whole process of saving lives. So I'm very grateful for each and every person here this evening. So my title, senior advisor, blah, blah, blah. Federal government likes a lot of roles and titles and words and acronyms, but my job on a day-to-day basis is to help people understand how they can competently and confidently talk about suicide and suicide prevention. So one of my biggest goals for this evening is to make sure that you all walk out of here with a little bit of knowledge and that you understand where you fall in this whole process of saving lives. So we got through the introduction. We're already successful, so big check mark there. Before we dive into discussion and all of the pieces that we're going to talk about tonight, I think it's particularly important that we all set a baseline of knowledge and information. So we're all starting on the same page. I talk about this day in, day out. I think about this when I go home. These facts, this knowledge kind of lives with me. No, okay. But I want to make sure everyone here kind of understands at least a good baseline of knowledge around suicide and suicide prevention. And so overall, when we think about suicide prevention, the best way to approach is through a public health approach, which we'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of my slide deck here. But with a public health approach, you always start with data. You start with data, you start with facts, you understand the problem through what we know so that we can better address it. So I want to walk through a little bit of the data with you. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, before we do that, something important. This is standard if you work in the government. What I express this evening does not represent the views of the federal government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very important legal piece. Oh, and I'm going to come this way, I'm getting some action moves here. So please know that I'm speaking on behalf of my knowledge, not on behalf of the federal government this evening. Another important disclaimer that Beth Ann gave was this is a potentially tough topic for a lot of people. Even just in the conversations I was having before I came on stage with a number of you outside the theater, there's a lot of experience in this room. There's a lot of personal knowledge, and there's a lot of potential strong emotions that live with all of that. So please, I encourage you, if anything comes up today, please reach out to your resources. For All Seasons is a tremendous resource that falls into that for many of you. So definitely make sure that you are checking in and connecting if that is something that you feel like you need. So now I'm standing in the right place, my mic's working, we're through the disclaimer. Let's jump into data. All right, so I'm not going to put you to sleep with data. I know that that is very, very possible after dinner in this heat. So I want to just point out some highlights and some important pieces. First of all, when we think about data and suicide prevention, it's actually very tough. Data is lagging for a number of reasons, and that's true of most mortality. There are a lot of systems that you have to go through before you understand what the pure data looks like. So we're running behind about 2 years in most scenarios. So a lot of the data that you'll see represents maybe 2021, 2020. We're just now getting into 2022 with a lot of our data. So big important numbers. When we think about the United States, almost 50,000 people in 2021 died by suicide. How that breaks down is it's predominantly a male population, and then females coming in at a lower number, and there are a lot of reasons behind that. Particularly important is that males tend to choose a more lethal way of dying, and that's typically firearms. Firearms are the most lethal way someone could die by suicide, and males are typically more comfortable or more engaged with firearms to have that as access. And we're going to jump into some caveats as I walk through the data, but know that there is a difference in risk when it comes between male and female. How that breaks down in Maryland, that's 620 individuals in Maryland, and all of this data is available to whoever is interested. There's some websites that you can check out. In the United States, suicide was the leading cause of death for those ages 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. Suicide was the third leading cause of death between 15 and 24, and the fourth leading cause of death for ages 35 to 44. So there isn't an age group that's immune to suicide, and that's one of the messages that kind of comes with understanding the data. There isn't an age group, there isn't a population, there isn't a race, there isn't a gender. Everyone is impacted by suicide, and so it's particularly important that we keep that in mind when we're trying to connect with people. The one that might be blocked by the chair here, middle-aged white males had the highest rate of suicide in 2021. That's a pretty common standard. It's been like that for a number of years, and there are a number of reasons why that is, given the factors that might play into someone's life when they're middle-aged and transitions and pieces like that. Yeah, the chairs are poorly placed. Yes, that is accurate. So I'll make sure I read whatever's on the bottom if anything's blocking. And so that was that fact that middle-aged men, white males, have the highest rate of suicide in 2021. If we jump to the next slide, I wanted to dive into the population-specific data just a little bit. And I want to say this before I do that these populations, just by being part of the population, it does not make you more inclined to be suicidal. There isn't a direct connection between being LGBTQ or being part of the veteran community or any of these special populations we're going to talk through that inherently makes you more suicidal. Just note that those populations might be going through having experiences that differ than the general population, which puts them more at risk. So in 2021, of those individuals that died that we just spoke about 3,000 of them were between the ages of 10 and 19. That's a significant portion of that number. And what we know is that if you fall into the LGBTQ population, there's a higher chance of suicide attempt and death. Again, not because it's inherently connected, but because some of the things that population might have to manage and deal with puts them at a little higher risk. Additionally, some special populations. This is the population I work with, active duty service members. In 2021, 519 service members died by suicide. Something my office also does is track spouses and dependents, so we follow that data as well. All of them fall under the care of the Department of Defense, and we want to make sure we're taking care of all of them. So again, we're going to start with the data to understand the problem. So 133 service member spouses and 69 dependents died by suicide. Next slide. For our veteran population, in 2020, again, data lags a little bit, 6,146 veteran suicide deaths happened. That is higher than the national standard. Depending on who you speak to, that's as much as 1.5 times higher. So our veteran population is a population that we really need to wrap our hands around and make sure that we are doing all we can to support. Additionally, and I know we have a number of our first responders in the audience tonight, 1% of that first big number, so that 50,000-ish number, 1% of those are first responders, and those individuals have died by suicide. So again, I bring these numbers in to start with knowledge, to start with facts, to start with understanding who might be more at risk, to understand who needs connection more, who needs support more, but also knowing that the general population is at risk. This is a public health concern, and that number is something that we really need to be working on. So I'm going to give you some other interesting data, facts, before we dive into the next piece. If we can go to the next slide. We talked a little bit about firearms when we talked about the gender difference between the data. Firearms accounted for 54.64% of all suicide deaths in the nation. For service members and veterans, that number is higher. Yes, ma'am. Oh, provider, you are correct. I did not include that. So providers such as nurses, those engaging in that like first line of care, there is also a significant risk within that population as well, given what they do. So thank you for bringing that in. We're going to kind of connect all of those pieces, but that's an important data piece. So when we think about firearms, we talked a little bit about the male versus female. And again, the military versus non-military. And I say this similar to the caveat I gave with our special populations we just walked through. Owning a firearm doesn't make you suicidal. There's nothing wrong with owning a firearm. But when someone is suicidal, if a firearm is present, they are more likely to die. That's what happens because firearms are the most lethal way of dying by suicide. So the discussion is never about restriction or removal. It's about understanding that there's safety there, that there is a safety piece that we need to engage in. Everyone can and should own firearms if that's what they want, but if something is wrong, we need to understand how to keep that environment safe, if that makes sense. Other important data pieces. This is something that we don't often talk about, and something that I think is really important for this group is that we talk a lot about the people who die by suicide, but not about the people who have attempted and the people who are suffering with suicidal ideation. And so there's this unofficial rule of 3 that we're taught when we learn about suicide, where if you take the number of people who die by suicide and multiply that by 3, that's likely the number of people who have attempted. And if you multiply that number by 3, that's likely the number of individuals who are working through some sort of suicidal ideation. So when we think about the numbers from 2021, 1,700,000 attempts, and that's likely low because there are attempts that don't go to the hospital, that don't get reported. And if we multiply that number again, we're looking at well over 5 million people who might be dealing with suicidal ideation, might be having thoughts of dying by suicide. So again, this is not just someone who may be in crisis, someone who's outwardly showing concern, someone who we're rushing to the hospital. There are likely well more than 5 million people who are having thoughts of dying by suicide. The other thing that I think is particularly important is a lot of people equate suicide with mental illness. That if someone dies by suicide, they automatically have depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, which we know is actually not the case. So per the knowledge that we've gained over these years, only 46% of people who die by suicide carry a mental health diagnosis, which means there is 54% of that number may not have engaged with mental health and may still have a mental health concern, but likely did not have a mental health concern that registered enough to have a diagnosis. That means what was going on in their life may not have been depression. Probably wasn't bipolar disorder. It was all of the other factors that play out in someone's life that led them to the point of considering death by suicide. And we're going to talk a little bit about those factors as we progress through. Lastly, and this was again evident by just chatting with everyone outside of this room, for every one person that dies by suicide, about 135 people are directly and intensely impacted. So if we think about that number, around 50,000 people, and we multiply that by 135, there are 100 numbers I can't do in my head that quickly. There are a lot of people walking around with that impact, and they're carrying around the potential grief and potential trauma that comes with that experience. And that makes conversations like this that we're having this evening even more important. We want to be able to be sure that those who've experienced this sort of thing have a venue, can be connected, can talk through that experience. Experiencing someone dying by suicide increases your own risk of dying by suicide. And so it just makes all of this even more important. So we got through the data, I think. Next slide. Okay, we got through the data. Wasn't too bad. But again, from a public health approach, that's where we want to start. We want to understand where the risk is and where we need to kind of wrap our hands around. When we think about suicide and the kind of origins of that in humans, we really think about a few specific things. And anyone who has read up on suicide or engaged in any research-related review, Thomas Joyner is usually a name that comes up very quickly. Thomas Joyner, I would say, is like the godfather of suicide prevention. I met him, it was like a celebrity moment for me. But he has a particularly important theory that I think resonates and helps us understand where the thought of dying by suicide could come from in someone. And so where this comes from is two specific feelings that you might be having, two specific thoughts. One is this perception that you are a burden to those around you, which is this idea of I can't do what I'm supposed to do, I can't be supportive, I can't engage in the things I'm supposed to do, take care of my family, hold down a job, whatever it is that's going on. It's this perception that I'm somehow taking resources away from people who need them or not adding to the resources that people need. The second piece of that is thwarted belongingness, and we're going to talk a lot about this. This kind of lives very deeply with me. I'm a psychodynamic psychologist. I can tell you a little bit more about that later, but it's all about connections and relationships. If you live in a place where you feel like you're alone, that is absolutely one of the factors that goes into considering death by suicide. So we have this I'm a burden, and we have this I'm alone feeling. And so imagine waking up every day and having both of those thoughts kind of bombard you. That's where a lot of people who die by suicide start. Like that's the origin of the thought process that's going on there. We add in this last piece, which is capability. Sometimes that's the sense of I'm not afraid of death, or everyone would be better off, this would be easier. There are things that make it almost like a gateway that opens for you. And when you add all of those pieces together, along with a ton of other complicating factors, that can lead to suicide. Next slide. And so those complicated factors, these are just a few. Suicide is so intensely complicated, and the factors that go into someone dying by suicide is unpredictable. And that's why we're still fighting this battle. All of these things I have listed up here, plus 17 more that I can think of off the top of my head, have been listed when we do psychological autopsies, which is kind of assessing someone's state and community after someone dies by suicide. We learn that any number of these things could be present. Particularly important, I mentioned again, only about half have that diagnosis of mental illness. So if you take one thing away from this part of the conversation, know that that's not always present in someone who dies by suicide. The second thing that I think is particularly important is the relationship issues. And depending on the study you look at, it's between 1 in 5 people have relationship issues at the time of death to 4 out of 5. So relationship, connection, that piece of feeling like you are not a burden and that you're not alone, again, is particularly important. Substance use and alcohol intoxication is complicated when we think about this, but know that at the time of death, most people have ingested or imbibed something. So alcohol is involved usually at the time of death, but there's usually a pattern of concern with that use. So those three stand out. Again, all of these things and a million other things could be going on, which again makes it so hard to wrap our arms around this. Next slide. But the good news, there is hope, and this is preventable. So as much as there are risk factors, there are protective factors. There are things that you can be doing and putting in your life that will help you from getting to the point, or help the people around you from getting to the point of crisis. And so there are things, internal, individual factors we think about, coping skills, connections you have. We talk a lot about reasons for living when we're working with someone who has thoughts of dying by suicide. That could be pets, that could be family, that could be a number of things. Again, the next level of that, if we think outwardly, is the connection you have with other people, the immediate people around you. The better you are connected, the more of a protective factor that is. Community factors are also important, and they're very similar when we think about the intimate relationship connections. Community factors, being connected to a spiritual community, being connected to your neighborhood community, being connected to the people that you engage with outside of your house is particularly important to have a sense of I'm not alone and that I do contribute and that I am a part of this. The other thing that goes with community protective factors is access to care when you need it. And so the community is typically where you would get care, and if there are barriers to that, there are going to be more risk factors present. So if there aren't appointments available, or the cost is prohibitive, or you can only do telehealth and no one in your area does telehealth. These are all things that at a community level we can switch. If we can make those things go away, they become protective factors for individuals. Next slide. And then the bigger pieces, societal protective factors. So this is harder when we think about suicide prevention, changing culture, changing people's minds, removing stigma. That's where we spend a lot of our time in prevention. So these are things like making sure that we use the right terms in articles about suicide, making sure that television shows aren't glorifying suicide. So there are things that we can do at a cultural level that also are going to impact and become protective factors. The fact that we're having a conversation like this with everyone here is a protective factor. We're lessening stigma, we're engaging and potentially connecting around these issues. So this is a good thing. This is what we want to do more of. The last thing I'll say, and if you've ever heard me speak before, I usually work this in somehow, is that protective factors are not things you do when you're in crisis. These aren't things that okay, now I'm feeling bad, I should probably start doing all of these protective factors. Let me connect, let me make sure I'm taking care of my health. Protective factors are like vitamins. You need to be doing them every day. They need to keep you healthy. That's truly what prevention is. Prevention is making sure something doesn't happen well upstream from it actually happening. So when we think about, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, the scope of interventions and prevention, protective factors are vitamins. Just remember that. Make sure you're checking in and doing all of these things as much as you can, even if you don't feel bad, because you just take a vitamin because it helps you. It makes your body better, all of the things that vitamins are supposed to do. All right, next slide. Last one. We're getting there. So this really connects to the theme of the evening. So I started this conversation with the public health approach. So this is an image of the public health approach and all of the places where someone could be in terms of needing intervention. When we think of prevention, it's the right-hand side of that slide, all of those blue triangles. And so that, again, is before someone is at the point of crisis or has attempted. These are all the things we could be doing before someone gets to that point. Some of the terms may seem a little odd. Universal would be things we do for everyone. It's that old saying, when the tide rises, all the boats rise. So if there are things you can make all the boats rise, it's going to help everyone kind of stave off that side of this image. The next is selective. Selective are for populations that we know are at higher risk. LGBTQ, veteran, first responders, our nurses and doctors on the front lines. So these would be things that we're doing specifically for that population. Again, not because we believe that they're all going to be suicidal, but because we know that on some level there's a higher chance, and so let's engage with that population more specifically. And then indicated would be those people who have identified that they are struggling with suicidality, which requires typically a different type of approach. That would be healthcare, spiritual care, something like that. And so why I explain all of this. The other side is also very important, and we're going to talk a little bit about that through the facilitated discussion. That would be after someone has an attempt, or if there are family members that are present in that person's life and they are now grieving because someone has died by suicide. So there's a bunch of things we can do on the other side of that spectrum as well. But I say all of this because everyone here fits somewhere in this model in terms of who they are, what they do, who they're connected to. And what you probably can't see because of these chairs. There are some categories I threw in there. One is policy. So if we're thinking about you, who you are, and whatever systems that you're a part of, are there policies present? Are there processes present? Are there standards present that make sure people have access to care, that make sure people are taking their vitamins, those sorts of things? So if you have that power, are you using it in a way that helps this side of the prevention? Similarly, are you a data person? Are you the one that has information that's going to inform other people in terms of information, in terms of intervention. There's research that you could be doing, partnerships and engagement, that's what I do. I get to talk with stakeholders and communities and help them understand where they fall on this, help them understand suicide, big picture, small picture in their communities, and help them understand how they can step in. Education and intervention. So there are more formal roles. So you could become a counselor. You could volunteer at a crisis hotline. So there are very specific things. So one of the goals we're going to talk about, I think, in our facilitated discussion is how can we help you all understand where you fit? So public health, everyone has a role. Everyone needs to have a role. Where do you fit? How can you step in? So that's the slides.
Come sit.
Sure.
Isn't he awesome? Just love it. That was a lot.
It was a lot.
It was
I'm
a lot.
sorry.
No, that was good. It was good. You just talked about so much data, and one of the things I was standing backstage thinking how incredibly wonderful it was that we talk about suicide prevention, but we don't always get those really important data points. Mm-hmm. And so I guess if there were 2 to 3 things, so Lisa Lee and I do our podcast, Bring on the Mess, every other week, and we talk about the nuggets, like what's the nugget that you want people to absorb from all of those statistics. If there were 2 or 3 things that you could say, hey, if you're gonna take some stuff, maybe it's these 2 or 3 things, what would you want people to take away from that data?
That's a great question. There's so many things I want you all to take away. I just want you to remember all of that. I would say particularly important for me when I think about education and prevention is kind of breaking down stigma and the connection a lot of people make with mental illness and suicide. And so that data point, about 46%, feels particularly important to me, knowing that a lot of people in our society are managing mental health concerns, and to have an automatic assumption that that person is suicidal or needs crisis care, or when someone talks about having a mental health concern, jumping to the fact that they might need crisis support feels particularly important. So just one of the things I would encourage is we have a lot of stigma around mental health care as well that we need to be breaking down, but jumping to the idea that someone needs that level of care or is thinking of dying by suicide because they discuss a mental illness just isn't something that's really helping the stigma around any of these conversations. So that would be one nugget.
Okay. So can I
Yes,
throw
please.
in another question?
Yes.
So part of what we talk about is what is stigma and how does it show up? And helping our audience and our viewers on Facebook understand what does stigma look like. I think you've given some examples of jumping to that point. We've also seen on the other side where someone will say, if we're out in the community, you want me to ask if someone's suicidal? And so can you talk a little bit about when we are encountering folks who are struggling? Yeah. So is that an okay question to ask? What's your perspective on that? I know what mine is, and I just would love to hear sort of your thoughts, because sometimes when we jump, we also are afraid to ask if we think it's something that needs to be addressed, but we don't know how to answer the question.
Yes. So yeah, when those situations come up, nerves on all sides. Yeah. How do I ask without offending? What if they say yes? What am I supposed to do? So there is a lot of fear around asking that question. So to more directly answer your question, I do think it's okay to ask. I think it's always appropriate to ask. How we do that is different for each situation, though, so it's not something we're going to lead a conversation with. There's going to be time that you take to understand what's going on, time to take to be with that person before you get to the point of asking that question. And one of the things that I always say, even now, I don't have all the answers. And so if I do ask a question and I don't know how to help, the best thing you can do is say, I hear you, and let's find out how to help together. So just making sure that you stay present with that person, that fear doesn't stop you from asking, because you can find the answer. We can all find the answer, and being with that person after they've been vulnerable is particularly important.
What I love about what you just said is it brings into the piece of what you've spoken about tonight, about connection, and recognizing that I might not be able to meet somebody here in the audience tonight and be able to jump right to that question.
Right.
But somebody that I know might be in that circle, or maybe I spend some time. And we talk about at our agency all the time. We do a lot of work with Brene Brown, and the idea that what we really need as human beings are 3 components. It's to be seen, heard, and valued. And it is my belief, and I would say the belief of Lisa Lee, who does the facilitating with me through Brene Brown, that when we see folks who don't have seen, heard, and valued in their scope of how they're feeling,
Yep.
that's when we find hiccups in people's lives, if you want to call it that, or areas where they're not doing well. And so if you think about somebody who's not having a good day, are they seen? Are they heard? Are they valued? If you peel that piece off, then usually that's when you find an opportunity to be able to say, help me understand what's happening. But maybe it's not you who can say that. So there's also this understanding that this is about a community.
Absolutely.
This isn't about, I have to have all the answers, because I might need to call you in and say, Andy, you're closer to this person
Yep.
than I am. Or, hey, could you help me understand how to address this?
Absolutely.
So as we think about the ways that our community is responding, for the folks who are listening, for the folks who are here in the audience, this might be something that they're venturing down for the first time.
Yes.
Might be something that as they're sitting here, they have that anxiety of, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to do this, how to address this, but they may have someone in their life that is currently struggling. And so we hear don't jump to, but what would be the path that you would provide as advice for the community and for our audience tonight of how to begin this journey?
Sure. I think journey is a good word for it. I'm still on that journey, even though I have these conversations daily. For me, it would start with the educating of yourself. And so this is a good first step if this is your first time.
Good first step, everybody.
Great. Yep, you're on that journey already. So starting with helping you understand not just the facts that I kind of walked through today, but also your own stance on suicide. That gets back to this idea of stigma or bias. For a lot of people, they're brought up in whatever way, whether that's culture, whether that's what they've seen in social media, whether that's what they've learned through spiritual connections, they have certain feelings about suicide and what it means, that it's selfish, that it brings shame, that it shouldn't be talked about. So one of the things that I talk about with providers, with parents, is really understanding where you sit with suicide is probably a perfect first step in understanding how to engage in that journey. If you approach that conversation with bias, if you believe that person who died by suicide should be shamed or whatever it is that you're holding in your head, that conversation with the person that you're trying to support is going to probably be a little harder. So start with yourself, I think, is a good first step. And then once you've gotten kind of the facts and you feel good about where you're sitting, start understanding the resources. It feels scary to feel helpless. And so one of the things we can do for ourselves is understand resources like your wonderful organization. We listed some of the crisis lines. There are a lot of people out here who want to help you understand how to have these conversations and understand how you can help or help the people that you are trying to help. So that would be the next step for me. And then it sounds silly, but I come from a medical background. You can role play with people. You can actually even call the crisis line yourself, and they can advise you on how to have these conversations. They can talk you through some of the things you might be concerned about. What's also great is if you do that, you have knowledge to help someone else. So if they're scared about calling and you've already called and talked to someone, you can say, no, they're great. This is what they do. It removes some of those barriers from the conversation.
So it sounds to me like no judgment in these conversations.
That would be a great start if possible. It's hard to not have any judgment when you're sitting with anyone, but understanding that you pushing your judgment in that situation is likely not going to cause connection, and that's really what we're hoping for.
And so you're not only talking about connection with the person that you're going to be speaking with and having a conversation with, but you're also talking about connection, that we don't have to do this alone.
Yes.
As a community. And so I might need to have a conversation, but I don't know how to have it, and I can enlist you prior to having that conversation. And so that really does bring about this whole piece of we all have a role to play.
Absolutely.
And especially, you mentioned young children. I have 4 boys at home, and so we think about the teenagers, and we think about social media, and we think about Netflix series like 13 Reasons and how all of that is coming into play. So I'm curious, what advice would you give to parents of teenagers specifically? Because, I don't consider myself to be old. However, I didn't grow up with social media at the age of 17, 14, 13,
Sure.
and 12 as my children are.
Yep.
And so what advice would you give to parents as it comes to this topic, especially when there's this exposure between YouTube and Netflix and Facebook and Instagram, as to how to approach this conversation and check in with our kids?
Yeah, that is a great question. First, I'll say there's probably no right way to do it. So I don't have exact words of wisdom from my standpoint in terms of you should say these words at this time. But one of the things, and this goes back to kind of the heart of the conversation, is just making sure that there is open and honest dialogue present, and there's the capability to talk about it. That when these things come up, they're not shut down, that they're explored. So if you can create an environment of openness in discussing any issue, concerns, emotions, relationships, you're going to probably be in a better position to support and have them come to you. I would say also, just in general, asking about your kids is a good thing. So often you can set up routines where you ask questions and engage. And if you want to slip in questions about how they're doing and how they're connecting with people and addressing some of the risk factors we talked about, if you set a routine around those things, kids love routines even as much as they push back against them. It's a good way of kind of working into those conversations.
Yeah, I love that, because the routine piece and sort of slipping in those questions and making it, I think about take your vitamins,
Yes.
so making that kind of a part of your daily routine with your kids to check in, and know that sometimes you're going to have to recheck, because we'll have folks say, well, I checked in with them and they said they don't need anything. And so sometimes it's about circling back, because
Absolutely.
how many of us have kids at home and you say, well, how was your day? Fine. Anything happen? No. And so sometimes it's also about us having to frame our questions in a way that our children have to give more than one-word answers to.
Absolutely.
And so it sounds like not only do we have to think about what we're going to say, but we also have to be in a place to have the conversation. So if I've had a really hard day and I'm super stressed, it's probably not the ideal time for me to have that kind of a integral.
100%.
And so, like, the check-in is going to be important for us as the adults, too.
Absolutely. Oh, yes. That is an integral part of good advice, checking in with yourself before you engage. It's a lot of emotional energy to support someone when they do want to engage in these more intense conversations. So if your battery's running on 0, it's going to be a lot harder for you to have a meaningful, supportive conversation. It's that airplane adage, put your own oxygen mask on first. And so that's really important when you're having these conversations, making sure that you're in a good place.
And I love that, because it models for our kids, so that they'll learn from us that maybe they're not prepared to have a conversation when their oxygen mask isn't on either.
Exactly.
I think that's a great piece. One of the things that we know is that there's folks in the audience who have lost loved ones to suicide.
Yeah.
And so I again want to remind folks that we do have resources here. Lisa Lee, our Chief Clinical Officer, Dr. Serrato, our Chief Medical Director, are here at the Avalon. For you on Facebook, I want to remind you that the crisis lines are there, so please, if you are feeling triggered by tonight's conversation, please do not hesitate to reach out. One of the questions that has been asked in the community, and we talk through a great deal, is how do we help support the folks who have lost loved ones to suicide, who say, I didn't see the signs. I did everything I was supposed to do, and I still lost my loved one. I think that's an important topic that we don't always talk about, because there's a lot to work through and there's a lot to hold when someone has been lost in a family or friend to suicide.
Agree. The term we use in suicide prevention is postvention. So it's the things that you do for the community after someone dies by suicide, knowing again that if you've experienced someone dying by suicide, you were yourself at higher risk. So there are a number of things that you can do on different levels. So when you think about those protective factors, we can kind of walk through each one of those. But one of the biggest pieces that comes to mind is I hate to circle back to the common themes, but a lot of times stigma and bias stops people from reaching out for support. So the best way you can support is to remain connected, staying present, making sure they know that you're a safe place for some of these emotions to talk about, and letting them know that there's no right way to grieve, and that it's a process that is a lifetime long. And so you creating a safe space that does not fill with stigma or bias and helping them stay connected is going to be probably the most powerful thing to do. And then when we pull out that theme of connection, making sure that there are knowledge of resources. Again, not everyone who loses someone to suicide is going to need professional care or going to need spiritual guidance, but knowing that those things are present and knowing that those resources exist, removing barriers from those things is particularly important.
And I would imagine in times like that, our brains are programmed to have beginnings and ends and be able to have answers. And so I would imagine that one of the larger struggles is not being able to put closure by saying, here's A, here's B, here's C that led to D.
Yeah, yes, yep. Living with the questions of why is incredibly hard. And I think the hardest part of that is the person is no longer with us and we can't get a lot of answers to those questions. So living with those unanswerable questions can take a toll on anyone that might be experiencing them. I think knowing that there are a lot of great resources, articles, there's a lot of good information out there around something called post-traumatic growth. And so not saying you should run to make meaning of someone dying by suicide, that's a process that you can go through, that you can work through.
That may take years.
That may take,
right?
a never-ending.
The journey is not a straight line.
Exactly, a never-ending process. But there are things that you can do to make meaning of the life you shared with that person that can be particularly helpful in staving off some of those whys that linger.
I love that. I love that so much. So one of the things that I think is also important for us to address tonight is if someone is here in the theater with us or someone online is struggling.
Yeah.
What are some things that you would say from your perspective of working with the community that you would want someone to hear in this moment?
Oh, these are good questions.
That's why I'm here.
If someone were struggling right now, what would we want them to know and hear? The first is that they aren't alone, that there are a lot of people likely in their lives that are there to support them and care for them. And also there are ways to make connections. Connections are available. There are ways to make sure that you don't feel alone. And it may not be through me, but I will absolutely help you find those things. I say all the time with people, I may be a plumber and you need an electrician, but I can help you find an electrician. So making sure that they understand that they're not alone, that what they're experiencing is something that there can be a path forward from, that resources exist to help, and that how they feel right now may not be how they feel later on. And taking actions to die by suicide is a very permanent solution to things that may have a solution you just haven't found yet. And I would exhaust all resources in finding that solution.
I would, and I love your thoughts, and I'm so grateful that you're here with us to share your expertise and to be able to bring that to our community. There are some really special folks in the audience who hold a very special place in my heart, and it's our first responder community.
Yeah.
And Lisa Lee and I are doing a great amount of work with our first responders here in Talbot County and across our region. And I wonder, when it comes to the first responders and our veterans, what are some of the services that you know of and or ways that we can stay connected? Because sometimes what we find with our first responder community, we've been doing a lot of work with a program called Talbot First, where we're working with the police department, the fire department, our EMS workers, our 911 dispatchers. They hold a lot.
Yes.
And I think no different than, it struck me as you were talking about the veterans tonight. My family is full of service people. And even just reading your statistics yesterday about the spouse and the dependents that also are impacted by suicide and or take their lives. I just wonder if there's some expertise that you can share with us around that first responder community and how we as lay folks in the community can be mindful of some of the things that we might not be thinking of.
Sure. And I was speaking with a number of first responders just before this as well. I think one of the things that comes to mind are resources that involve peer-to-peer support. There are a ton of great resources in the veteran community and in the first responder community that allow those individuals to connect with people who have had like experiences. For a lot of people, there's this kind of barrier that that person's not going to understand. How could they possibly help me if they haven't had these same experiences? And as clinicians, we know that that's part of what might be a barrier to care. So I think starting with peer-to-peer, and I think as a peer, arming yourself as much as you can to have these conversations feels particularly important. You don't have to be the therapist, you don't have to be the chaplain, you don't have to be chaps, but you can prepare yourself to have important connecting conversations and then know the resources that people are going to feel comfortable with. And then, so I just go to the VA website, they have a ton of great things. And for our spouses, in particular, or people, family members of someone who might be a veteran or first responder, there are a lot of great resources out there for you as well, particularly around how to have these conversations with your loved one. It can be particularly hard if you have a very close, intimate relationship to bring in some of these things. And so there are a number of ways that you could learn from some of these resources. There are some great videos, there are some great scripts that you can sample and try out for yourself. So know that the resources exist out there, and I'm happy to provide like a full list when I'm not standing on stage and have to come up with 6 of them off the top of my head. But particularly looking at peer-to-peer and using close relationships. As you said, like the community around someone is going to be the greatest tool.
Right, yeah. And knowing that one size doesn't fit all, right?
Absolutely.
So what works for me as the daughter of a veteran might not work for my brother, or it might not work for my cousin, but we can try these things together and be able to share that information.
Absolutely. There is no one size fits all, but there is a need to engage with everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions and be able to have a part of our talk back. I'm so grateful again for you being here.
Sure.
So do we have questions that anybody would like to ask in the audience?
And they're still in a lot of trauma 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've done any research on, I mean, you don't have answers because you can't obviously talk to them, but have you done any research to uncover what may be behind that for young men?
For young men specifically, like ages 10 to, yes.
12 and one was 19.
Yeah.
And his mother had just dropped him off at college, and the last thing she said was, "I love you, son." And 2
Goodness.
days later, he hung himself.
It's a powerful story. Where we would encourage people to start is, and I don't want to make this too much about like the science and research, but the conversation would start with kind of where Joyner started. If there were feelings of burdensomeness or feelings of being alone, would be a place that you could start in seeking those answers. Again, it's going to be hard to find any concrete answers. And then there are means more scientifically when we think about those risk factors to kind of walk through and engage in discussions with support systems to understand if any of those factors are present. It's what we do in federal government systems. Again, I mentioned this psychological autopsy. So, for example, when a service member dies by suicide in the military, there are a lot of things we do to try and understand if there are things that we could have done differently or things we need to fix for the next person that might be in that situation. So there are a lot of systemic things to do, but for the average person, you're not going to jump into a psychological autopsy. But I would start with making sure that the people around you feel like they're not alone and they're not a burden. That would be where I start. I think a lot of the why questions are to try to save us from having to go through it again. Like, how could I avoid this from happening again? And if we start back at that theory and we start talking to people about that connection and that they aren't a burden, I think that's a good way to engage in prevention in that one-on-one way.
Thank you.
Great question.
Get another question over here. I think
Just curious, what's some of the less obvious signs of suicide? There's obvious signs out there, but the things we should be looking for that are maybe less, obvious, not top of mind, or sometimes, I know in my particular case, in my family, my brother took his life, there were just no signs there. We didn't see it. So sometimes you live with that guilt, but I just didn't see it. Years later, you look back and you go, okay, he did give some clothes away and things like that. Are there things that folks should be looking for, that are less obvious, and that's a tough question?
It is a very tough question. And I don't want to not answer, but I'm going to kind of not answer. What I would say is check on everyone. Make sure that everyone has that same sense of feeling connected and not having that sense of burden. It kind of connects to, you brought in nurses and the helpers. The helpers often have to portray that they have it all together, and that's the impression that they give. They still need to be checked in on. They still need to have important conversations about how they feel connected, and any sense of burden that they might feel in their life. So I would say I don't have a good answer for what we're not seeing, but we can ask those questions to make sure we're addressing the things we're not seeing, if that makes sense.
I imagine you could also think about things like if someone's mood has shifted dramatically.
Yes.
If you're seeing, the audience member who just asked the question mentioned giving clothes away, and so sometimes we know that
Yes.
we know that there are times where people are very structured and they have a real plan in place that may be not something that happened overnight. And so
Yes.
also possibly thinking through if you're seeing somebody's personality shift, if you're seeing whether it is a total shift, whether it's maybe something that you're picking up on that feels a little bit different. I always say, when we think about mental health, there's a gut check. And we have to check our gut
Yep.
and trust our gut. And also we know that sometimes there just isn't going to be a sign. And I would imagine that that's probably when you're working in suicide prevention and when you're working with families who have lost someone to suicide, that can be the hardest piece of there just might not be signs.
Yep. Yes, a number of individuals come to mind in families that I've worked with where that is the case, and there's this perception that suicide always comes from a long brooding period of depression, and that you would see signs like you're describing, and sometimes that's just not the case. That adds to this big complicated picture that is suicide and prevention, and why we haven't quite cracked that nut just yet.
Another question? We've got one in the back and then one here.
So I'm just curious, as an educator,
Yeah.
I work with high school age students, and we talk about mental health. We spend an entire unit discussing it on top of many other standards that touch upon, things that lead towards that, or the warning signs, as you would say.
Yeah.
What kind of guidance would you provide to educators who are tasked with working with students on the subject but don't have the support necessarily from parents and community, that, when we talk about these subjects, we get those phone calls from the school, like, this shouldn't be taught to my student in this fashion. They should be listening to, the statistics about suicide and the
Yeah.
stigmas that are there around it.
Yep. Oh, God bless you. That, yeah, no, that when you said that you were having a whole unit on mental health, like I just got excited that that's something that's happening. It sounds weird, but I want to go back to that kind of image I had up here at the end of the informational section. And having worked in way too many federal systems, it's finding the inroads to people that can change those barriers. So there are policymakers, there are people on the school board, there are inroads that they also have a role in prevention. And as an educator, it's weird because your role turns into education for those people rather than those students. And so that's the road I would take, having been in similar situations in hospital settings where my leadership is saying that's not what needs to happen. I have to spend extra hours and extra time figuring out how I can get them on the same page. And that's how you can make that systemic change that I think you're looking for. So it sounds weird, but like change your educator lens and push it up and then rather than down a, exactly, there you go.
Well, and I imagine in that what I was picturing as you were talking is it's also about aligning with your allies. So it's not just one educator, but there's always going to be folks who are in that same like mind to be able to then approach in a way of not, we're doing this wrong, but could we consider doing this differently?
Exactly,
Yeah.
Yep. And you found an ally already, so sign me up to wherever you're educating and we'll make it happen. Yeah. Yeah.
We had another question up here.
Thank you. This doesn't seem, okay, very good. Got to get it close. Do you have any advice for how to deal with people who, in my experience at least, seem to feel a great sense of anger and guilt that they didn't prevent this from happening?
Goodness. So let me make sure I have the perspective correctly. This would be you engaging with someone who's kind of expressing that to you, or would this just be like the advice for that person that's experiencing that?
Recently had an experience like this with a serviceman that committed suicide and dealing with his parents.
Oh, yes.
And I've had it actually a couple different times in my life, a friend that committed suicide. And it seems that, to me anyway, that, I guess it's a pretty natural thing, that people have a sense of guilt.
Yep.
And they get very angry that either they can't do anything about it or that you can't do anything about it as maybe a service provider.
I think you've even already begun to answer your own question, where I would tend to start, having sat in a room with someone expressing those things to me, having those similar feelings myself, is starting with kind of the normalization of that. Of course you're going to feel that way. This is a terrible situation that you're working through right now, in a situation that no one teaches you how to grieve. There's not a class you take on this. It's not something that you engage with growing up. And so those feelings of anger, those feelings of guilt, potentially feelings of shame, for some people it's no feelings at all, and they're really scared that they have no feelings about that. So starting with kind of the normalization that there's no right way to do this, and what you're feeling right now likely makes sense for the position that you're in. I find that starting there, again, psychodynamic psychologist, we could have another hour talk about that, but that brings you back to the connection. Like that, I'm not telling you you're wrong, I'm not pushing you away, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. It's like, yeah, that makes sense, and I'm here with you, and I'm sitting with you through that. And I don't know that I have an answer. There's not an easy solution, but I'm going to be here with you as you feel those things, as you walk through that grief.
I love what you just said about being able to not necessarily have the answer, but sometimes the simplicity of thank you so much for sharing, I'm here. We don't have to, I think sometimes when topics come up that are difficult or when someone is really struggling, we tend as humans to want to package it up and put a bow on top of it and be able to say, okay, well, I've solved that problem. Like, we're solvers, that's what we do.
Yes.
And so being able to simply sit in that space. And I would say the other thing that I think we have found in the work as a mental health agency is that so when you're feeling feelings of anger and guilt today, you might feel fine tomorrow. And the next day, thank you so much. You might feel fine tomorrow. And you might be good for a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden, there may be something that totally isn't what you expected to trigger you. Or you may find yourself back in a space of, I'm feeling this again.
Yeah.
And so, I say to the folks that we work with, the only guarantee is there's no guarantee what the journey's going to look like.
100%. I use the analogy of taking a boulder and throwing it into a still lake. When you throw that boulder in, there are huge ripples. And that's kind of the experience of grief. You're like working through really intense moments and moments where it's not there anymore and more intense moments. And those ripples just continue out, and they're going to get less intense over time. But working with someone who experienced traumatic death of a spouse 10 years ago, came in and they were upset at themselves because they were still feeling those ripples. And that's exactly what happens when you throw a boulder into a lake. Those ripples are going to come up. And so I have, even my friends will say it now, oh, it's just a ripple coming up when they tear up at a commercial or whatever it is that happens to spark that. So just understanding that it is going to be something that is an ongoing journey is important.
Thank you.
So we've got a question from someone online.
Sure.
They say, I've heard you are not supposed to tell someone that has thoughts of suicide that everything will be okay. What can I do to encourage someone that's feeling this way?
Yeah. It's if you put yourself in the position of someone who might be struggling with suicide, they've gotten to a point where they almost feel like nothing's going to be okay. Again, it's that sense of burdensome, all alone, and then the capability, it's not going to get any better. And so to say everything's going to be okay, or this is just, it'll pass, get better, walk it off, whatever it is that comes to mind, is putting you at odds against them. It's again, I'm going to just hammer this into you guys, the connection, you're severing the connection right then and there. So instead of going in the direction of, let me pull you out of that hole, let me tell you it's going to be okay, spend time with them understanding why it feels that way and how you can work together to find other ways to feel differently.
There's also the other side of that coin.
Yeah.
Where people will go, well, you have all these responsibilities, you can't do this, you've got children in college, you've got a wife, that just
Oof.
exacerbates the whole thing.
Yeah, piling on, I've noticed all your risk factors and I'm going to list them for you.
Dr. Moon,
I don't know that
Moon,
that's the most helpful thing to do.
for everyone at home, can you repeat that comment, because that's really important for everyone at home to hear.
Sure. It was just shared that some people take the complete opposite and say, well, here's all the reasons why you're supposed to live, why all the responsibilities that you have, all the things that you need to take care of, and list off all of the things. And that might not be particularly helpful either.
Anecdotally, and you have the data to show us the rate of suicide, the incidence of suicide actually increased very significantly. What do you feel are the societal changes that have made suicide more likely?
So I'm just going to repeat that so folks
Sure.
online can hear the question. The question was about the fact that we've seen suicide increase, and what are the factors that contribute to that increase? Did I have that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, you are correct. Every year that rate increases nationwide. And we are still, if I had all the answers to that, I think we would be there, but there are things that do come to mind. And it is particularly around how we as a culture approach support and approach connection. So a lot of it to me is at that biggest level of culture. And so how we talk about support, how we talk about engaging in taking care of yourself, how we talk about mental health. I was chatting with, I think the sheriff actually right outside, that taking care of yourself, going in for checkups, talking with a mental health provider should be seen as maintenance on your car. that you might not feel bad, your car might not be making a noise, but you still go in and get the tires rotated and you check the oil and all of those things. I don't, I have no clue how any of that works. But you take it to someone and they do it for you. And so when I think about like our culture on how we support people or how we help people access the things that will be those vitamins for them, I think we need to make those things more accessible. We need to normalize those things. Those need to be part of what we do on a regular basis.
I have a question here. You shared some data about what's happening, in Maryland and also across the country, I imagine. What does it look like globally, whether it's Europe or Africa or South America, Latin America, Asia? Are there trends that are similar in those nations and those continents, similar to what we're experiencing in Maryland or in the United States?
Unfortunately, the trends are very similar internationally. Suicide is something that I don't think any country or culture has gotten its hands around. And if you look specifically at the data, I think there was only one country in the last set of data that came out that plateaued and didn't rise. So internationally, it's flowing in the same direction, and maybe not necessarily for the same reasons. I can say, so I worked with Peace Corps for a number of years as a psychologist and got to travel to a number of countries. And in some of those countries, Guyana specifically, suicide became a norm. It became something that was like common and okay. And so their rates and what they're fighting against from a prevention standpoint is vastly different than perhaps here or some of the other countries, but no country has it figured out just yet. Yes, yeah, it's an option. So again, if we think about that joiner model, the capacity and the capability, they've just made it normalized. So they just kind of threw a factor in there that's going to make suicide probably more present in their culture.
One more?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for coming out tonight and having this conversation. My wife and I are, I'm a suicide survivor, plus my wife and I, in a span of 15 months, dealt with 2 suicides in our family. One was a nephew she was very close to, and the other was a LGBTQ foster child that we had taken in. We knew the signs. We did everything we thought we could. We had connected to the resources in the community. We deal with it very differently. I use that to motivate me to talk about this topic so that people can see that we're all human. She tends to shy away from it, and that's why she's not here tonight. What can I do to support people like her who are so meaningful in my life? And I know this is such a heavy burden on her.
That's a great question. I want to start just by saying thank you for sharing your story, particularly powerful, and I'm glad you're here with us. I would say first step, you're doing a lot by being a role model in how you're engaging with it. We talked a little bit about post-traumatic growth and making meaning and finding a way forward to help others who might be going through similar things. So one, I think you're taking a big step in being a role model for your wife in this scenario. So that's a good first step. And I would fall back on the continue to make space for it. You had talked about your children, like 1 minute they're fine, and then the next minute they might not be. So don't be afraid to keep opening the conversation, because there may be at a point in their grief process where they're not ready, and then they may be ready. And for you to continue to hold that door open is going to be particularly important.
You are such a...
Oh, gosh.
I want to say to everyone here tonight, there's been several stories that have been shared about family members who have been lost in suicide. We've talked about friends, and I know that there's a lot of folks in the audience, and I'm sure at home, that are holding a lot tonight. And I just, our motto at the agency is to make sure that people are seen, heard, and valued. And so I want you to hear that from us tonight, that this is about community. And you're here with us tonight, not because you're being paid, not because
I'm not
there's
being
any.
paid.
Right. Sorry.
Just kidding.
That ahead of time. You know, this is a presentation where when I said to you, would you? You said
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's what this community is about. That's what this conversation is about. It's about bringing this to light. You know, we knew that this was a heavy topic. How do you say, hey, come spend an evening and talk about suicide? But it's important, and I just want to say to all of you, thank you so much for being here. You know, 4 Seasons serves the 5 counties of the Midshore, and we're really such an integral part of our whole mental health scope. You know, we've got folks from Midshore Behavioral Health here who work with all of our providers. There's the Sante group, which is our responders that are going to be helping in crisis and meet folks where they are in the community. We have launched a new open access program. There's walk-in appointments available 5 days a week, folks, at 4 Seasons. There's no wait list. And
That's huge.
it's huge. You know, we would be remiss tonight if we didn't share with you some of those resources within our community. There are folks from our local management boards that are here who help to provide funding. There's folks from some of the governor's office task force. I love that you keep coming up to me. Here we go. Number 3. 3 is going to be the charm, you guys. So I just want to say on behalf of 4 Seasons, on behalf of our staff and our board, thank you for being a part of our community. We don't do this alone. We are never going to be able to come up with all of the answers. But as we sit here tonight, we hope that this becomes a springboard. This is Suicide Prevention Month. But it doesn't mean that September is the only month that we have to pay attention to suicide prevention. And it is our hope tonight that you're going to take some of those nuggets, that you're going to have heard something here, that you'll share some of what you have heard tonight. There's plenty of walks that take place in this month. There's plenty of other activities. Please seek out other organizations that are putting on some really great work in this community. If there's anyone who needs anything afterwards, we have tons of our staff here. We're more than glad to talk with you about resources. And please know that you are not alone, and that our Ask, Listen, Share campaign is something we can all be a part of. It doesn't take a lot of time to ask the question, how are you doing? To send a text to someone, to check in on someone. We're often so busy, myself included, running to the next meeting or taking the next phone call or getting the kid to the next practice, that sometimes when we ask that question, we don't necessarily stick around for the answer. And so making sure that we're not only asking that question, but we're sticking in to listen, and to listen with a whole heart, with no judgment, so that when that person says, I'm not doing okay, we know we don't have to have the answer to solve the problem, but we can be a part of the solution by sharing out those resources. So we encourage you to think about Ask, Listen, Share. Continue to check in on folks. And we are grateful for Dr. Moon being here with us tonight. And we're grateful to all of you for being a part of our suicide prevention campaign. And it really is true that no matter what, you do matter. Thank you.